Samuel Ward had lived alone for 8 years, speaking only to his cattle and the wind. But tonight, 10 Apache women appeared at his gate during a fierce winter storm. Their clothes were torn, their faces marked by fear. Behind them, armed riders were closing in fast. Samuel faced an impossible choice: open his door and risk everything, or turn away and let innocent people die in the storm. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and time was running out. Chapter 1: The Weight of Old Wounds. Samuel's hand trembled as he reached for the heavy wooden bar that secured his door. 8 winters had passed since he'd last removed it for another human being. 8 winters since Martha and little Emily had been buried beneath the oak tree that now stood like a silent guardian over their graves. The women outside spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Their language was Apache, but one voice broke through in broken English, pleading for help from someone they knew lived inside. The desperation in that voice cut through Samuel's defenses like a blade through paper. Samuel pressed his forehead against the rough oak door. The wood was cold, matching the ice that had settled around his heart the day he'd found his family's bodies. Raiders had come while he was in town, getting supplies. By the time he'd returned, smoke was still rising from what remained of his old life. That was when Samuel Ward, the neighbor, the friend, the husband and father, had died. The man who'd taken his place lived alone, spoke to no one, and trusted nothing that walked on 2 legs. For 8 years, that iron bar had kept the world and its violence firmly outside his sanctuary. Through a crack in the shutters, Samuel could see them more clearly now. 10 women, some barely more than girls, huddled together against the storm. Their traditional dresses were torn and stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. One held a bundle close to her chest, and Samuel realized with a start that it was a baby. The oldest woman stepped forward, her gray hair whipping in the wind. She spoke directly to the door, as if she knew exactly where he stood. Her words painted a picture too familiar to Samuel's own nightmare. Bad men with guns who killed for sport. A burned village. Dead husbands and sons. These women were all that remained of their people. Samuel's chest tightened. The story echoed his own tragedy, but where his family had died alone and undefended, these women had somehow escaped. They fought their way through 3 days of wilderness to reach his door, carrying their wounded and their only surviving child. The sound of horses grew louder in the distance, not the random movement of wild animals, but the steady rhythm of mounted men moving with deadly purpose. The pursuers were close, maybe minutes away from surrounding his property. Samuel looked at his rifle mounted above the fireplace, then back at the door that had protected his solitude for 8 long years. That bar had kept the world out, but lifting it tonight might let death itself walk into his home. The baby's cry, weak and desperate, cut through his fears like a blade. Some sounds demanded an answer, regardless of the cost to the man who heard them. Chapter 2: Hunters in the Night. Samuel lifted the heavy bar and pulled the door open. Cold wind and rain swept into his cabin as the 10 women hurried inside, bringing with them the smell of smoke, fear, and dried blood. The oldest woman nodded her thanks, but her eyes never stopped scanning the windows, watching for movement in the darkness beyond. The woman who had spoken through the door stepped forward. She was younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 30, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested leadership despite her torn clothes. She introduced herself as Ayanna, and her first words carried a warning that chilled Samuel's blood. They brought danger to his home, she said. Death was following close behind them. Samuel barred the door and turned to face his unexpected guests. The baby was crying softly now, and he could see that several of the women were injured. Cuts, bruises, and burns marked their arms and faces. These weren't people who had simply fled their homes. They were survivors of something terrible, something that had left scars both visible and hidden. Ayanna's story unfolded like a nightmare Samuel recognized from his own past. Captain Reynolds had come with his militia 3 days earlier, claiming the Apache village harbored hostile warriors. But there had been no warriors, only families trying to live in peace. When the elders asked to see official orders, Reynolds' men had started shooting. What followed was systematic slaughter disguised as military necessity. Samuel felt familiar anger building in his chest. He'd heard similar stories before, though he'd tried to shut them out along with everything else from the outside world. Official raids that were really just murder dressed up in uniform. Men who wore badges but had forgotten what honor meant. The details painted a picture of organized brutality. Reynolds commanded more than a dozen men, all of them hunting the escaped women with single-minded determination. They couldn't afford to let witnesses survive, especially witnesses who had seen the truth behind their official reports. The sound of horses was getting closer now, no longer distant thunder, but the clear approach of multiple riders. Samuel moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. Torches flickered through the trees about half a mile out. The riders were taking their time, confident their prey was trapped. Samuel turned back to the women who were now clustered near his fireplace. Some tended to wounds, while others comforted the youngest among them. They looked like survivors, not warriors. But there was something in their eyes that suggested they weren't planning to die easily. They held makeshift weapons and positioned themselves with the awareness of people who had learned to fight for their lives. Samuel looked around his cabin, at these women who had trusted him with their survival, then at his rifle hanging above the fireplace. 8 years of hiding had ended tonight. The only question now was whether he'd remember how to fight. Chapter 3: When Sanctuary Becomes Battlefield. The torches stopped moving about 100 yards from Samuel's cabin. Through the gaps in his shutters, he could count at least a dozen mounted figures forming a loose circle around his property. They weren't in any hurry now. They believed they had their prey cornered, trapped like animals in a cage of their own making. Samuel pulled his rifle down from above the fireplace and checked the action. The Winchester was clean and well-maintained, a habit from his old life that had survived 8 years of isolation. Behind him, the Apache women moved with quiet efficiency, checking their own weapons and positioning themselves throughout the cabin with practiced awareness. Captain Reynolds' voice boomed across the clearing, confident and commanding. He claimed to be tracking escaped hostiles who had murdered settlers, demanding they be sent out in exchange for Samuel's safety. The lie came easily to the militia captain, dressed up in official language that made murder sound like a lawful duty. Samuel recognized the rhetoric from his past, when he'd still believed that uniforms meant honor. Ayanna positioned herself beside Samuel at the window, moving silently despite the wooden floors. Her warning proved prophetic. Reynolds couldn't let Samuel live either way, she explained. He had seen the truth about these women, knew they weren't the killers Reynolds claimed them to be. Witnesses to the real story were dangerous to men who built their careers on manufactured wars. When Reynolds called out Samuel's name, using his identity to try to establish authority, Samuel realized this wasn't a random encounter. The militia had done their research, knew who lived in this isolated ranch. They had planned to use his property as the final killing ground for their systematic hunt. Samuel surprised himself by responding, his voice carrying across the night air after 8 years of silence. He challenged Reynolds' story directly, pointing out that the women hadn't murdered anyone while suggesting that the captain himself might have plenty of blood on his hands. The accusation hit its mark, stripping away Reynolds' pretense of official duty. The captain's desperation became clear as his lies crumbled under scrutiny. When Samuel exposed the truth about Reynolds' operations, describing how the militia showed up at peaceful villages to slaughter families, the mask finally fell away completely. Reynolds had no more excuses, no more official sanction to hide behind. The first rifle shot cracked from the trees, splintering wood inches from Samuel's head. The talking was over. Reynolds had shown his true colors, abandoning any pretense of law and order in favor of simple murder. The only conversation now would be conducted with bullets, and Samuel's sanctuary had officially become a battlefield. Samuel dropped below the window as more shots rang out, his body remembering the instincts that had kept him alive during darker times. Around him, the Apache women took cover with practiced ease, their movements revealing that this wasn't their first fight. They had survived 3 days of pursuit through hostile territory, and they intended to survive the night. Chapter 4. Unlikely Warriors. The first assault came from three sides at once. Reynolds knew his business, sending men to flank the cabin while others provided covering fire from the front. But as Samuel aimed through his window, he realized the Apache women weren't cowering in fear. They were moving with the precision of experienced fighters, each one taking position with deadly purpose. Ayanna had positioned herself near the back door with a captured rifle in her hands. Two younger women crouched by the side windows, their knives ready for anyone who got too close. The oldest woman, Nayeli, held the baby while directing the others with hand signals Samuel had never seen before, a complex system of communication that spoke of military-level training. A militiaman broke from cover near the woodshed, running low toward the cabin. Samuel lined up a shot, but before he could fire, one of the women by the side window threw her knife with deadly accuracy. The blade caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the mud with a cry of pain and surprise. Samuel watched in amazement as the women fought with tactical awareness that matched anything he'd seen during his own wartime service. These weren't desperate refugees making last stands. They were trained warriors who had been systematically underestimated by their enemies, and that miscalculation was costing Reynolds' men dearly. The Apache women conserved ammunition and chose their targets carefully. When one ran low on bullets, another would cover her position while she reloaded. They fought with the coordination of people who had trained together, who knew each other's capabilities and limitations. Their movements flowed like water, deadly and efficient. During a brief lull in the shooting, Samuel observed Nayeli speaking quietly to Ayanna. The words were in Apache, but Samuel could read the tactical nature of their discussion in their gestures and expressions. They weren't just fighting desperately. They were fighting smart, adapting to the terrain and their enemies' weaknesses with practiced skill. Samuel began to understand that these women represented something Reynolds had never encountered before. Apache warriors who had taught their wives and daughters not just to survive, but to wage war when survival wasn't enough. The militia captain had expected to find helpless victims, but instead he faced opponents who had been preparing for exactly this kind of fight. The truth became clear as Samuel watched Ayanna move between positions with fluid grace. Her husband had taught her to shoot before he'd taught her to cook, she'd said. But it was more than that. These women carried the tactical knowledge of their people, passed down through generations who had learned to fight against overwhelming odds and somehow find ways to win. Reynolds' voice boomed across the clearing again, but this time it carried frustration rather than confidence. He was losing men and gaining nothing but respect for opponents he'd completely misjudged. His easy massacre had become a costly battle, and the night was far from over. Samuel chambered another round and called back his own response, letting Reynolds know that these women had shown him more honor in 1 hour than the captain had managed in his entire career. The answering volley of gunfire was Reynolds' reply, but this time, Samuel wasn't facing it alone. Chapter 5. The Price of Justice. The gunfire had been quiet for nearly an hour when Samuel heard the sound that made his blood run cold. More horses are approaching from the east, their hoofbeats steady and organized. Reynolds was calling in reinforcements, turning what had been a desperate standoff into something far more dangerous. Samuel counted at least 20 new riders through his spyglass as they crested the hill. The militia captain had escalated this into a full military operation, surrounding Samuel's cabin with enough firepower to level a small town. The odds had shifted from difficult to impossible. Around the cabin, the Apache women assessed their situation with grim determination. Ayanna moved between positions, checking ammunition and tending to wounds. The youngest fighter, barely 18 and bleeding from a bullet graze, still gripped her rifle with steady hands. Her name was Eatsell, and despite her injury, her eyes held the same fierce resolve that Samuel recognized in all the survivors. Nayeli continued to hold the baby, whispering soft words in Apache that seemed to keep the child calm despite the chaos surrounding them. The old woman's presence provided an anchor of peace in a situation that grew more desperate with each passing moment. Samuel looked around his cabin, now riddled with bullet holes and filled with smoke from the damaged fireplace. 8 years ago, this place had been his sanctuary from a violent world. Tonight, it might become his tomb, but as he watched these women prepare to make their final stand, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't facing death alone. The sound of Reynolds organizing his expanded force drifted across the clearing. Orders are being given, positions being assigned. The captain was methodical now, planning to crush any remaining resistance with overwhelming numbers. But just as despair began to settle over the defenders, a new sound cut through the night. A single horse approached at speed, its rider calling out with authority that was different from the militia's harsh commands. Deputy Marshal Harrison announced himself with the backing of federal law, riding alone but carrying the weight of justice behind him. Samuel watched through his spyglass as the federal lawman confronted Reynolds in the torchlight. The marshal had been tracking the captain's illegal operations for months, gathering evidence of systematic murder disguised as official duty. Harrison carried sworn statements from survivors, documentation of burned villages, and proof that Reynolds was a killer rather than a protector. The atmosphere around the cabin shifted as federal agents materialized from the darkness behind the marshal. They had been watching this confrontation unfold, waiting for the perfect moment to expose Reynolds' crimes to the light of day. Hope flickered in the eyes of the Apache women for the first time since they had arrived at Samuel's door. But Reynolds still commanded superior numbers, and desperate men with blood on their hands rarely surrendered without a final, violent struggle. Chapter 6: Dawn of Reckoning. Deputy Marshal Harrison emerged from the darkness like an answer to a prayer Samuel hadn't dared to offer. The federal lawman rode with quiet authority, his badge catching the torchlight as more figures materialized behind him. These weren't militia reinforcements. They were federal agents who had been watching Reynolds' operations from the shadows, gathering evidence of systematic murder disguised as official duty. Samuel watched through his rifle scope as the dynamic around his cabin shifted completely. Reynolds tried to maintain his facade, claiming the Apache women were dangerous criminals who had attacked innocent settlements. But Harrison carried documents that told a different story. Sworn statements from survivors, evidence of burned villages, testimony that painted Reynolds not as a protector of settlers, but as a predator in uniform. The militia captain's desperation became obvious as his lies crumbled under federal scrutiny. Reynolds had built his campaign of murder on a foundation of personal revenge, using his brother's death in a barroom brawl as justification for killing innocent Apache families. When Ayanna called out the truth about that death, Samuel saw the mask finally slip from Reynolds' face. The man had no more excuses left, no more lies to hide behind. His own soldiers began backing away as they realized they had been following a killer rather than serving justice. Without the protection of official sanction, Reynolds stood exposed as what he truly was. Samuel felt time slow as Reynolds raised his rifle toward the cabin one final time. The captain's finger found the trigger, but Samuel's Winchester was already trained on the target. The shot rang out across the clearing, sharp and final. Reynolds crumpled into the mud, his weapon falling harmlessly beside him. Dawn broke over the eastern hills as the last echoes of gunfire faded into silence. The sky burned gold and crimson, painting the world in colors that seemed fitting for the end of a long nightmare. Samuel lowered his rifle and felt 8 years of isolation lifting from his shoulders like morning mist. Around the cabin, federal agents moved efficiently to secure the scene and take statements from the surviving militia members. The Apache women emerged from the bullet-riddled cabin, blinking in the early sunlight. They had survived the night, but more importantly, they had seen justice served against the man who had destroyed their families. Samuel stood in his doorway, looking out at the aftermath of the battle that had changed everything. His sanctuary was destroyed, but his soul was finally free. Chapter 7: Beyond the Horizon. Dawn broke over Samuel's ranch with the kind of light that seemed to wash the world clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind air that smelled of rain and possibility rather than gunpowder and death. Federal agents moved efficiently around the property, documenting evidence and taking statements from the surviving militia members who had surrendered once Reynolds fell. Samuel stood in the doorway of his bullet-riddled cabin, watching Deputy Marshal Harrison supervise the cleanup of 8 years of isolation ending in a single night of violence. The marshal had been thorough in his investigation, carrying documentation that would ensure Reynolds' crimes became part of the official record rather than buried in military reports. The Apache women prepared to leave as the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky. Their wounds had been tended, their testimony recorded, and arrangements made for safe passage to relatives who had escaped Reynolds' systematic campaign. Federal protection and compensation had been promised, though Samuel knew no amount of money could restore their murdered families. Ayanna approached Samuel as he surveyed the damage to his home. Bullet holes marked every wall, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. The sanctuary he had built through 8 years of solitude lay in ruins, but somehow that destruction felt like liberation rather than loss. She carried news that brought both relief and sorrow. The baby had survived the night, along with all 10 women who had sought shelter at his gate. But the cost had been measured in more than damaged property. 2 of Reynolds' men had died in the fighting, and several others would carry wounds that matched the scars already borne by their intended victims. Samuel understood that his old life had died with the lifting of that iron bar. The hermit who had hidden from the world's violence was gone, replaced by someone who remembered that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Martha and Emily would have approved, he thought. They had always believed that kindness meant action when action was needed. As the Apache women mounted their horses for the journey north, Samuel made his own decision about the future. The ranch could be rebuilt, but the man who would rebuild it would be someone different. Someone who wouldn't turn away when desperate people knocked at his door in the night. Ayanna paused beside her horse, looking back at the man who had chosen to stand with them when standing meant risking everything. Her words carried the weight of a promise that their paths might cross again someday, when the world needed people who remembered the difference between justice and law. Samuel watched them ride toward the horizon until they disappeared into the morning light. Then he turned back to his damaged home, ready to begin the work of becoming the man he was meant to be. What would you have done in Samuel's place? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one.